Hi, everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. I am absolutely thrilled to have you here today. We are going to unpack an event that literally rewired the modern world. If you're a student of history or international relations, you really can't grasp today's global power structures without understanding what went down just over 3 decades ago. We're talking, of course, about the collapse of the Soviet Union. Because it wasn't just a country falling apart, right? It was a monumental geopolitical earthquake. So let's dive right into this. Here is our quick roadmap for today. 1. Two superpowers, two ideologies. 2. Cracks in the sandpile. 3. The unintended collapse. And 4. The new global order. So let's start off with a pretty crucial question. Why does the fall of a country 35 years ago actually matter to us today? Well, the answer is that the 1991 dissolution of the USSR didn't just, redraw lines on a map. It completely shifted the paradigms we use to evaluate global power, security, and economics. Decades-old alliances just vanished. New nations were born out of nowhere. And that overarching threat of nuclear Armageddon that hung over an entire generation, it suddenly dissolved. It permanently altered our modern geopolitical reality. All right, Section 1, two superpowers, two ideologies. For nearly half a century, the globe was essentially fractured into two massive spheres of influence, and they were driven by incredibly different views of how society should operate. On one side, you had the United States, championing liberal two-party democracy and an advanced capitalist economy running on free enterprise. And then, on the exact opposite side, you had the USSR, a one-party Marxist-Leninist state with a centrally controlled economy where private wealth was, basically outlawed. Now, these differences absolutely terrified Western powers, who saw free choice as the most important thing in the world, while communist nations just kept pushing forward, expanding their own technological and military might. When you look at how this massive global standoff even started, historians are actually divided in this really fascinating historiography debate. You've got orthodox historians who tend to point the finger straight at Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union, highlighting their inherent expansionism and this doctrine of global revolution. But on the flip side, revisionist historians argue that the U.S. and its allies definitely share the blame. They point to the West refusing to recognize Soviet spheres of influence and President Truman using what they call atomic diplomacy. And then you have post-revisionists like John Lewis Gaddis who say, actually, it was this super complex mix of mutual misperceptions, messy domestic politics, and just undeniable paranoia on both sides. And to really understand that Soviet paranoia, you gotta look at this staggering number, 20 million. During World War II, 20 million Soviet citizens died. Plus, over 30,000 Soviet factories were just utterly leveled by the Nazi onslaught. It's almost hard to wrap your head around that level of devastation. Because of it, some historians point out that Stalin's post-war actions, like taking control of Poland and dominating the Balkans, were actually, in his mind, a defensive attempt to build a buffer zone and avoid capitalist encirclement. Moving on to Section 2, cracks in the sandpile. To wrap our heads around the internal pressures building up in the late 1980s, historian John Lewis Gaddis has this brilliant metaphor. He describes the late Soviet system as a sandpile ready to slide. Sure, on the outside, the USSR projected all this immense military might, but internally, it was incredibly fragile. They were dealing with crippling economic stagnation, this hideously expensive and basically unwinnable war in Afghanistan, the massive financial burden of trying to match the U.S. arms buildup, and just a total inability to raise the living standards for everyday regular citizens. Enter Mikhail Gorbachev in 1985. He sees these deep systemic issues, and so he introduces a critical policy catalyst, glasnost. It translates to openness. The whole idea was to promote a free flow of ideas so citizens could actually openly discuss and try to solve the country's problems. Sounds good on paper, right? But here is the critical point. Gorbachev fundamentally underestimated the sheer, overwhelming level of disgust that had built up toward the Soviet system, especially within those Eastern European satellite nations. Because here's what happens. When you take a population that is burdened by immense economic pressure and you suddenly hand them the freedom to openly express how mad they are, well, you don't get calm, rational problem solving. You open the floodgates. This new policy of openness sparked a massive geopolitical shift, moving power straight away from the central authoritarian government in Moscow and putting it directly into the hands of the people. Which brings us to Section 3, the unintended collapse. A massive driver of this whole implosion was Gorbachev's policy of reform through inaction. Gaddis actually points out that the revolution succeeded largely because Gorbachev chose to just not do anything. Unlike the guys before him, who violently crushed uprisings in places like Hungary or Czechoslovakia, Gorbachev essentially sat back. When everyday citizens realized, hey, we can protest, we can tear down symbols of authority, and we can change society without getting shot at, that central control just evaporated. And the dominoes fell incredibly fast. Just look at 1989 alone. First, the Hungarian government ceremonializes the reburial of a previously executed uprising leader. Then, the Polish Solidarity Union, which used to be banned, wins a national election by an absolute landslide, and Moscow does nothing to stop it. Then, famously, regular citizens literally take sledgehammers to the Berlin Wall. This rapid chain reaction of people realizing their own power culminated in 1991 with the complete and total dissolution of the USSR. To really picture the massive scale of the shift, realize that from the ashes of just one single superpower, 15 brand new independent nations suddenly stepped onto the global stage. Armenia, Azerbaijan, Belarus, Estonia, Georgia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Latvia, Lithuania, Moldova, Russia, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Ukraine, and Uzbekistan. The map of the entire world was fundamentally redrawn almost overnight. So what happens when half of the world's bipolar power structure just vanishes into thin air? Let's look at Section 4, the new global order. Economist Paul Krugman argues that this event did way more than just end a country. He says it destroyed the socialist dream. Worldwide, the ideological legitimacy of communism completely tanked. Without the Soviet Union there as the main ideological and financial sugar daddy, communist movements globally collapsed. Crucial economic subsidies vanished overnight. Places like Cuba and North Korea were suddenly left facing severe economic disrepair and starvation, totally cut off without Moscow's support. It really looked like capitalism and democracy had emerged as the undisputed, uncontested champions. But let's contrast that for a second with an insight from political scientist Robert Kagan. He points out that the West's initial jubilation, this hope for universal peace and a fully unified democratic global market, was basically just wishful thinking. The modern world really wanted to believe that all ideological conflicts were permanently over. But as we know from studying international relations, power vacuums, they rarely stay empty for long. On top of that, this massive shift destabilized the neutral coalitions too. Take the non-aligned movement, for example. It existed specifically to navigate the awkward space between the US and the USSR. With the Soviets gone, the movement fundamentally transformed. Yugoslavia, which was a prominent founding member, violently broke apart and was suspended from the group in 1992. India, another key founder, heavily downgraded its emphasis on the coalition. The entire geopolitical board was tilted. So what about Russia itself? Well, while the 1990s were marked by severe economic misery and a totally devalued currency, Russia absolutely did not remain weak. They rebounded, and they rebounded forcefully. Russia started leveraging its vast, incredibly abundant energy resources over a very energy-starved Europe. Starting in the early 2000s, they experienced years of steady 7% economic growth, drastically reducing poverty and totally rebuilding their national treasury. And Kagan points out that with this economic rebound came the return of autocracy and traditional hard power calculations. Modern Russia has reasserted its dominance by using that European energy leverage as a direct political tool. We've seen military interventions in Georgia to support separatist movements, economic pressure to force Moldova into the Commonwealth of Independent States, and a very clear drive to reestablish traditional spheres of influence. It is a direct challenge to the Western vision of a peaceful, unipolar world. To explain this whole dynamic, political scientist Samuel P. Huntington offers his clash of civilizations theory. He argues that post-Cold War conflicts aren't going to be driven by pure economic ideology, like capitalism versus communism anymore. Instead, they'll be driven by fundamental differences in culture and religion. So, from this realist perspective, Russia isn't necessarily trying to recreate the old Marxist Soviet Union. Rather, it's successfully gathering this orthodox heartland bloc of culturally similar neighbors to push back hard against Western liberalism. Which leaves us with this final, provocative thought to ponder as students with global power. Did the Cold War truly end in 1991? Or did it just change shape? Did the collapse of the Soviet Union actually erase the great power struggles of the 20th century? Or did it merely reorganize them, setting the stage for the deeply complex, multi-layered conflicts we are facing today? It's a massive question, and understanding the history we just covered is really the only way to find the answer. Thank you so much for joining me today on The Explainer. Keep asking those tough questions, keep studying the structures of power, and I will see you next time.